The aisle of the Boeing 777 was dead silent. Every eye in the first-class cabin was locked on the young, smirking flight attendant standing over a black woman in seat 1A. "I will not ask you again," the attendant hissed, her voice dripping with venom, her hand hovering aggressively over her radio. "You need to gather your bags and move to the back, or I will have Port Authority officers drag you off this aircraft in handcuffs." The woman in the seat didn't flinch. She calmly adjusted her glasses, sipping her pre-flight water. Before she could utter a single word in her defense, the heavy, reinforced cockpit door clicked open. A seasoned captain stepped out, his face immediately draining of color. But his impending fury wasn't aimed at the passenger. It was aimed squarely at his own flight attendant. The rain was coming down in sheets against the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of John F. Kennedy International Airport, blurring the neon lights of the runway into a smeared painting of reds and blues. Josephine Crawford, Josie to her friends and colleagues, sat quietly in the exclusive Oceanic Global Airlines lounge, savoring the last sip of her Earl Grey tea. At 58, Josie had earned every right to enjoy the quiet luxuries of life. She was the senior aeronautical structural engineer and lead safety consultant for one of the largest aerospace firms in the world. Her signature was required before multi-million-dollar jets were legally allowed to leave the tarmac. Tonight, she was exhausted. She had spent the last 3 weeks crawling through the underbellies of commercial aircraft in Seattle, auditing structural integrity reports. All she wanted was to board Flight 88 to London Heathrow, sink into her lie-flat pod in seat 1A, and sleep for the next 7 hours. She wore an understated, tailored, cream-colored cashmere sweater, tailored black slacks, and comfortable loafers. She didn't look like new money, and she certainly didn't feel the need to broadcast her wealth with flashy logos. True power, she had learned decades ago, whispered. It never screamed. When the boarding call finally echoed through the lounge for first-class passengers, Josie packed her laptop into her worn leather briefcase and made her way to Gate 42. The jet bridge was cold, smelling faintly of aviation fuel and damp carpet. As she stepped onto the plane, she was greeted by the lead flight attendant, Brenna Gable. Brenna was a woman in her late 20s, immaculately groomed, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe, shellacked twist. Her uniform was crisp, but her smile was decidedly rigid, a practiced, customer service mask that didn't quite reach her icy blue eyes. "Boarding pass?" Brenna asked, her tone clipped, barely glancing at Josie. Josie held up her phone, displaying the digital pass. The large, bold 1A glowed on the screen. Brenna blinked. She looked from the phone to Josie, taking in the black woman's unpretentious attire, her natural hair pulled into a neat, low bun, and the absence of a trailing entourage or Louis Vuitton luggage. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in Brenna's posture. It was a micro-expression Josie had seen 1,000 times in her life. The slight narrowing of the eyes, the tightening of the jaw. It was the look of someone silently recalibrating their reality, because the person standing in front of them didn't fit their narrow, preconceived narrative. "Right down the aisle. First pod on the left," Brenna said, though her voice had lost the honeyed tone she had just used on the white businessman who had boarded ahead of Josie. Josie nodded politely and turned into the cabin. The first-class section of Oceanic Global's 777 was a sanctuary of ambient lighting, polished wood accents, and pristine privacy pods. She stowed her briefcase in the overhead bin, settled into 1A, and breathed a sigh of relief. The seat was massive, plush, and perfectly secluded. She pulled out a thick paperback novel and waited for the rest of the boarding process to conclude. 10 minutes later, the piece was shattered. "Excuse me?" No, No, this is entirely unacceptable." The voice was shrill, cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin like a siren. Josie lowered her book. Marching down the aisle was Margaret Hinsley, a woman draped in an excessive amount of designer logos, her wrists clanking with heavy gold bangles. She was holding a boarding pass as if it were a soiled diaper, glaring at the seat numbers. Brenner materialized instantly, her rigid smile back in place, only this time it was apologetic. "Mrs. Hinsley, welcome back. Is there a problem with your seat?" "You bet there's a problem, Brenner," Margaret huffed, dramatically dropping her oversized tote bag into the aisle. "I specifically requested a window seat in the front row. 1A. I am a Platinum Elite member. My husband is on the board of Oceanic's parent company." "Why does my ticket say 3B? 3B is an aisle seat, next to the galley. I cannot be expected to sleep next to the galley." Brenner glanced nervously at the manifest on her tablet. "I apologize, Mrs. Hinsley. It looks like there was an equipment change last night, and the seating assignments were automatically shuffled by the system. Let me see what I can do." Margaret crossed her arms, tapping a leopard print heel against the carpet. "Well, fix it. Whoever is in 1A will just have to move. They probably upgraded with miles anyway." Brenner turned her gaze toward the front of the cabin. Her eyes landed on seat 1A. They landed on Josie. Josie watched the exchange with mild detachment, assuming the airline staff would simply apologize and explain to the irate woman that the cabin was fully booked. After all, a purchased ticket was a purchased ticket. But as Brenner looked at her, Josie saw something dangerous flash in the flight attendant's eyes. It wasn't just a desire to please a high-tier customer. It was an opportunistic calculation. Brenner had already decided, based purely on her own biases, that the quiet black woman in the unbranded sweater didn't belong in the $12,000 seat. Brenner straightened her skirt, took a deep breath, and began to walk toward seat 1A. "Excuse me, ma'am," Brenner said, leaning over the partition of Josie's pod. Her voice was loud. Too loud. It was the kind of volume designed to draw an audience, to ensure that everyone in the first-class cabin was suddenly aware of the interaction. Josie placed a bookmark in her novel and looked up. "Yes? I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again," Brenner demanded, holding out her hand. There was no "please." There was no polite inquiry. It was an order. Josie frowned slightly, maintaining her absolute composure. "Is there a problem? I scanned it at the gate and showed it to you when I boarded." "We are just doing a routine cabin check to ensure everyone is in their correct zones," Brenner lied smoothly, though she hadn't asked a single other passenger for their pass. "Sometimes people wander into the wrong cabin by mistake. It happens all the time." Josie knew exactly what was happening. She unlocked her phone, pulled up the airline app, and handed the device to Brenner. "As you can see, 1A, Josephine Crawford." Brenner stared at the screen. She tapped it, as if expecting the pixels to rearrange themselves to reveal an economy ticket. When they didn't, she handed the phone back, her lips pursed in a tight line. "I see. Well, Miss Crawford, there seems to be an administrative error in our system. You'll need to gather your belongings." "An administrative error?" Josie asked, her voice calm, modulated, and entirely unbothered. "What kind of error?" "This seat was previously reserved for one of our VIP Platinum members," Brenner explained, gesturing subtly toward Margaret, who was hovering in the aisle like a vulture waiting for a meal. "The system mistakenly double-booked it. Since Mrs. Hinsley has priority status with Oceanic Global, I'm going to have to ask you to relocate." "Relocate to where, exactly?" Josie asked. She knew the first-class cabin was entirely full. She had checked the seat map an hour ago. "I have secured a very comfortable aisle seat for you in our premium economy cabin," Brenner said, pasting on a patronizing smile. I will personally ensure you receive a complimentary beverage for the inconvenience." A complimentary beverage for a $12,000 ticket downgrade. Josie almost laughed, but the sheer audacity of the request kept her grounded in the reality of the moment. She looked past Brenner to Margaret, who was practically smirking, already mentally redecorating the pod. "No, thank you," Josie said simply. She picked up her book again. Brenner froze. Clearly she hadn't anticipated a refusal. In Brenner's world, authority, especially when wielded against someone she deemed beneath her, was absolute. "Excuse me?" "I said, no thank you," Josie repeated, looking the flight attendant directly in the eye. "I purchased this ticket 6 months ago. I did not upgrade with miles. I did not fly standby. I paid the full international first-class fare. My name is on the manifest for this specific seat. If your system double-booked it, which I highly doubt, that is a matter for your gate agents to resolve with the other passenger. I am not moving to premium economy." A murmur rippled through the cabin. A few passengers in rows 2 and 3 had lowered their noise-cancelling headphones to listen in. Margaret pushed her way forward, practically stepping on Brenner's heels. "Do you know who I am?" Margaret snapped, glaring down at Josie. "My husband is a board member. I fly this route twice a month. You are sitting in my seat." "I don't care if your husband is the ghost of the Wright brothers," Josie replied evenly, never raising her voice. "The ticket in my phone says 1A. Therefore, it is my seat. I suggest you take this up with customer service." Brenner's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. Her authority was being challenged in front of a VIP and half the cabin. She decided to double down, leaning closer to Josie, dropping the fake customer service veneer entirely. "Listen to me very carefully," Brenner said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I don't know how you scammed your way into this cabin. Maybe a glitch. Maybe you know someone in ticketing. But people like you do not get to speak to our premium guests that way. You are causing a disturbance. Now you can either walk to premium economy on your own 2 feet, or I can make this very, very difficult for you." Josie felt the familiar, cold prickle of adrenaline, but she forced her heart rate to remain steady. "People like me?" Josie asked softly. "Would you care to elaborate on what you mean by people like me?" Brenner scoffed, crossing her arms. "Don't play dumb. You know exactly what I mean. You don't belong up here. Now get up." The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from mildly uncomfortable to suffocatingly tense. The white businessman across the aisle in 1B was staring openly, his jaw slightly slack. An older couple in row 2 exchanged worried glances. Nobody intervened. They rarely did. Josie slowly closed her book and placed it on the small console table next to her. She looked at Brenner. "I am going to ask you one time to step away from my personal space. I am a paying passenger. I am following all FAA regulations. I am sitting in my assigned seat. If you continue to harass me, I will be forced to file a formal complaint not only with Oceanic Global, but with the Federal Aviation Administration." Margaret gasped dramatically. "The absolute nerve. Brenner, are you going to let her talk to you like this? She's threatening you." "She's not going anywhere, Mrs. Hinsley," Brenner assured the irate woman, her eyes flashing with a dangerous mix of panic and cruelty. Brenner reached to her shoulder and unclipped the radio attached to her lapel. "Flight deck, this is Gable in first," Brenner barked into the radio. "Go ahead, Brenner," a crackly voice responded. It was the first officer. "I need the gate agent back down here, and I need Port Authority on standby at the jet bridge," Brenner said, staring daggers at Josie. "We have an unruly passenger in seat 1A who is refusing crew instructions and causing a hostile environment. We may need to forcibly remove her." "Copy that. Captain is stepping out of the pre-flight briefing now. I'll notify him. Gate agent is currently overwhelmed with a baggage dispute, but security is a minute out. Try to de-escalate." Brenner clicked the radio off and smiled a tight, triumphant smile at Josie. "You heard him. Security is on the way. You have about 60 seconds to grab your bag and take the walk of shame to economy, or you are going to be escorted off this plane in handcuffs. Your choice. But I promise you, once Port Authority gets here, you won't be flying on this airline ever again." Josie didn't move. She didn't reach for her bag. She didn't break eye contact. Inside, her mind was racing, but it was analytical, not fearful. She knew the law. She knew passenger rights better than almost anyone on the planet. A flight attendant couldn't unilaterally declare a passenger unruly simply for refusing a non-safety-related downgrade, especially without involving the captain's authority. But Josie also knew the reality of the world she lived in. She knew what it looked like when a black woman was accused of being hostile and unruly by a hysterical white woman. She had seen the viral videos. She knew how quickly things could escalate into physical violence when armed officers boarded a plane with biased context. "I want your employee identification number," Josie said, her voice cutting through the silence of the cabin like a steel blade. "You don't get to demand anything from me," Brenner sneered. "You lost that privilege when you decided to be difficult." "And I want the captain," Josie continued, ignoring the flight attendant's outburst. "The pilot in command is the ultimate authority on this aircraft. Before you have me arrested for sitting in the seat I paid for, I want the captain standing right here, looking me in the eye, and telling me to leave." Margaret laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, honey, the captain doesn't have time for people like you. He's busy flying the plane." "Actually, Mrs. Hinsley," Brenner said smoothly, "I think that's a wonderful idea. When the captain sees this situation, he will happily sign the removal order himself. He has zero tolerance for insubordination." Brenner turned back to the galley, hitting the intercom button designed to page the cockpit directly. "Captain, I apologize for the interruption. This is Brenner in first class. I need you to step out of the cockpit immediately. I have a highly aggressive passenger in 1A who is refusing to comply with federal crew instructions, and I need your authorization to have security forcibly drag her off the aircraft." The intercom crackled. A deep, resonant voice echoed back, sounding slightly annoyed. "I'm on my way, Brenner. Have security wait on the bridge. Nobody touches the passenger until I assess the situation." "Understood, Captain," Brenner said, her voice dripping with syrupy compliance. She turned back to Josie, her arms crossed, looking down her nose. "You played a stupid game, and now you're going to win a stupid prize. The captain is going to throw you off himself." Josie remained seated. She adjusted her glasses, took a slow, deep breath, and waited. The aisle was dead silent. All eyes were locked on the smirking flight attendant and the quiet black woman. Brenner's hand hovered over her radio, ready to call the police the second the captain gave the nod. Then, the heavy, reinforced cockpit door clicked. The metal hinges groaned slightly as it swung open. Captain Thomas Brighton stepped out into the galley. He was a tall man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair, immaculate four-stripe epaulets on his shoulders, and an aura of absolute, unquestionable authority. He had flown for 30 years, logged over 20,000 hours in the sky, and was widely regarded as the most senior, respected pilot in the oceanic global fleet. He marched into the first-class cabin, his brow furrowed in irritation, holding a clipboard with the flight manifest. "All right, Brenner," Captain Brighton said, his booming voice demanding immediate attention. What is this about a passenger threatening my crew?" "Right here, Captain," Brenner said eagerly, pointing a manicured finger directly at Josie. "This woman is in Mrs. Hinsley's seat. She's refusing to move. She's forged a boarding pass, and she has become incredibly aggressive and hostile. I need you to sign the removal order so the officers can take her away." Captain Brighton stopped. He looked at Brenner, then followed her pointing finger down to the passenger, sitting calmly in seat 1A. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the captain just stared. He dropped his pen. It hit the carpet with a soft thud. The irritation vanished from Captain Brighton's face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. All the color drained from his cheeks. He didn't look at the passenger with anger. He looked at her with a profound, almost reverent panic. "Josie," the captain breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence that fell over the first-class cabin of Flight 88 was absolute, the kind of heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a violent storm. The faint hum of the Boeing 777's auxiliary power unit and the distant patter of rain against the fuselage were the only sounds left in the world. Captain Thomas Brighton stood frozen at the edge of the galley, his eyes wide, the color completely drained from his usually ruddy face. The clipboard in his left hand trembled slightly. Brenner Gable, completely misreading the room, broke the silence with a triumphant, self-satisfied scoff. "You know her, Captain? Oh, thank goodness. That makes this so much easier. If she's a known security risk or a repeat offender, the Port Authority officers are already waiting at the end of the jet bridge. I told them we had a severe non-compliance issue. Just sign the removal order right here, and we can finally push back from the gate." She thrust a crumpled incident slip toward the captain, a smug smile plastered across her face as she glanced sideways at Margaret Hinsley. Margaret offered a vindicated nod, already gripping the handle of her oversized designer tote, ready to claim her prize. Captain Brighton didn't look at the slip. He didn't look at Brenner. He didn't look at Margaret. He moved past the flight attendant, as if she were entirely invisible, his heavy black boots sinking into the plush carpet. He stopped right at the edge of seat 1A. Slowly, deliberately, the veteran pilot lowered himself until he was at eye level with the woman sitting there. His posture was not one of an enforcer, but of profound, unadulterated respect. "Chief Engineer Crawford," Captain Brighton said, his booming voice suddenly incredibly gentle, filled with an unmistakable current of apology. I am so deeply sorry. I had absolutely no idea it was you sitting in 1A. The manifest just printed your initials on the cockpit copy." Josie adjusted her glasses and offered the captain a small, composed smile. "It's quite all right, Tom. I wasn't trying to make a fuss. I was simply trying to read my book before takeoff. It's been a long 3 weeks in Seattle." "You were auditing the new strut casings on the Dreamliner fleet, weren't you?" Captain Brighton asked, genuinely interested, his professional demeanor returning as he spoke to a peer he clearly admired. "I read your preliminary safety brief last month. Brilliant work catching that microfracture issue in the titanium housing. You saved the airline, and the industry, billions. Not to mention the lives involved. Just doing my job, Tom," Josie replied softly. "Safety first. Always." Behind the captain, Brenner's triumphant smile had shattered. Her hand, still holding the incident slip, slowly fell to her side. Her brain was frantically trying to process the exchange happening in front of her, but the gears were jamming. Chief engineer, auditing fleets, saving billions. This didn't fit the narrative she had constructed. This didn't fit the profile of the woman she had assumed was an interloper who had scammed her way into a $12,000 seat. "Captain," Brenner interrupted, her voice entirely stripped of its previous bravado. It squeaked slightly, betraying the sudden, icy spike of panic blooming in her chest. "Captain Brighton, I don't understand. This passenger, she is refusing my crew instructions. She has a fraudulent boarding pass. Mrs. Hinsley here is a Platinum Elite member, and her husband is on the board. This woman needs to be removed." Captain Brighton slowly stood up. When he turned to face Brenner, the gentle respect he had shown Josie was gone, replaced by a glacial, terrifying fury. He was a man who commanded hundreds of tons of metal through the sky. He did not tolerate insubordination, and he certainly did not tolerate bigotry masquerading as protocol. "Brenner," the captain said, his voice dangerously low, "do you have any idea who you are talking to?" "A passenger who is causing a disturbance," Brenner insisted, though she took a half-step backward, suddenly terrified of the man standing before her. "The woman you are currently harassing," Captain Brighton said, emphasizing every syllable so it carried perfectly through the silent cabin, "is Josephine Crawford. She is the Global Director of Aeronautical Structural Safety and the lead independent auditor for the Federal Aviation Administration's Heavy Aircraft Division. She doesn't just fly on these planes, Brenner. She signs the airworthiness certificates that legally allow them to leave the ground. In fact, she personally signed off on this exact aircraft, tail number N7720G, after its heavy maintenance check yesterday. If she says this plane isn't fit to fly, Oceanic Global grounds it, instantly, no questions asked." A collective gasp echoed through the first-class cabin. The white businessman in 1B, who had been watching the entire ordeal, visibly cringed, shrinking back into his seat. Captain Brighton stepped closer to Brenner, his jaw locked. "Furthermore, she is a Tier 1 corporate partner with Oceanic Global. Her travel profile dictates that she is guaranteed Seat 1A on any aircraft she boards for official safety business. Her boarding pass is not fraudulent. It is the most legitimate piece of paper on this entire airplane." Brenner's face went from pale to a sickly, ashen grey. Her meticulously shellacked hair suddenly seemed to be the only thing holding her together. I didn't know," she stammered, her eyes darting nervously around the cabin, realizing that every single passenger was watching her humiliation unfold. "The system," Mrs. Hinsley said. "I don't care what Mrs. Hinsley said," Captain Brighton snapped, his patience entirely evaporated. Margaret Hinsley, who had been hovering near the galley, suddenly realized the shield of her entitlement was disintegrating. She puffed up her chest, relying on her only weapon. "Now see here, Captain. There is no need to raise your voice at the crew. I am still a Platinum member, and my husband, Charles Hinsley, sits on the board of Oceanic's parent holding company. I demanded this seat, and I expect to be accommodated." Josie finally spoke up, her voice calm, cutting through the escalating tension like a precision laser. "Mrs. Hinsley?" Margaret glared at her. "What?" "Your husband, Charles, is a regional vice president of marketing for a subsidiary brand," Josie said smoothly, stating the facts with ruthless accuracy. "He is a non-voting member of a regional advisory committee. He does not sit on the executive board. He certainly does not hold the authority to override an FAA-mandated safety auditor's travel itinerary. Furthermore, under Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, interfering with a crew member or attempting to use undue influence to bypass ticketing manifests is a federal offense." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Her heavy gold bangles clanked together as her hands began to shake. The absolute certainty in Josie's voice, combined with the brutal unmasking of her husband's actual corporate standing, shattered her illusion of supremacy. "I was just on a conference call with the FAA administrator and Oceanic's actual CEO, Gordon, 3 hours ago," Josie continued, her tone conversational, but devastating. Would you like me to call Gordon right now and ask him if Charles Hinsley's wife is authorized to dictate aircraft seating arrangements by harassing other passengers? No, Margaret whispered, her face burning a bright, splotchy red. That won't be necessary. I didn't think so, Josie said politely. She turned her attention back to the flight attendant, who looked entirely ready to faint. Now, Brenner, let's discuss your behavior. The jet bridge door suddenly rattled, and two heavy-set Port Authority police officers stepped into the aircraft galley. They were wearing tactical vests, their radios crackling with airport chatter. They looked serious, their eyes scanning the cabin for the hostile threat they had been dispatched to handle. Captain, the lead officer said, touching the brim of his hat. Dispatch said you had a code 3 in first class. Aggressive passenger refusing to deplane. We're here to escort them out. Brenner saw the officers and experienced a fleeting, desperate surge of hope. Her brain, unable to process the sheer magnitude of her error, reverted to its original programming. Authority was here to back her up. She pointed a trembling finger at Josie. Officers, it's her. Seat 1A. She is the disturbance. She needs to be removed immediately. The lead officer reached for his handcuffs, taking a step toward the aisle. Hold your position, officer, Captain Brighton roared, throwing his arm out to physically block the policeman from entering the aisle. The sheer volume and authority of the command stopped the officer dead in his tracks. Captain? The officer asked, confused, his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt. We got a call from the lead flight attendant. The flight attendant was severely mistaken, and she overstepped her authority, Captain Brighton stated firmly, his eyes locked on the police. There is no hostile passenger in seat 1A. The passenger in 1A is a VIP corporate safety auditor and a personal friend. The only disturbance on this aircraft has been caused by my own crew. The officers exchanged bewildered glances, slowly backing down. Copy that, Captain. Your ship, your call. Do you need us to clear out? No, Josie said quietly from her seat. Everyone turned to look at her. Josie slowly stood up. She smoothed the front of her cream-colored cashmere sweater, picked up her leather briefcase, and pulled out a sleek, government-issued tablet. Officers, please remain right where you are, Josie instructed, her voice holding the calm, unshakable authority of someone who spent her life dictating protocols to billionaires and politicians. Captain Brighton, under the guidelines of crew resource management and FAA safety protocols, I am officially declaring a compromised safety environment on this flight. Captain Brighton nodded slowly, understanding exactly what was happening. Understood, Director Crawford. Brenner shook her head, tears of pure panic finally welling up in her icy blue eyes. What? What does that mean? I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to help a high-tier customer. You can't do this. You did everything wrong, Brenner, Josie said, her gaze pinning the younger woman to the spot. You allowed your personal biases to dictate your professional conduct. You profiled me the moment I stepped onto this aircraft. You ignored standard manifest verification procedures. You lied to my face about an administrative error. You attempted to use the threat of armed law enforcement to intimidate and humiliate me into surrendering a seat I legally purchased. And you did all of this while compromising the safety and security of the boarding process. Josie began tapping rapidly on her tablet. As a lead safety auditor, if I observe a crew member exhibiting erratic, discriminatory, or hostile behavior, it is my federal duty to report it. A flight attendant who weaponizes the police against a compliant passenger because of their race or appearance is a liability in the air. If there were a real emergency at 30,000 feet, I cannot trust you to perform your duties objectively or safely. I am not a liability, Brenna cried, her voice cracking, her professional facade entirely obliterated. She looked at Captain Brighton, pleading, Captain, please, this is my career. I have a spotless record. Your record just caught up with reality, Brenna, Captain Brighton said coldly. He turned his back on her, fully aligning himself with Josie. Director Crawford is entirely correct. I cannot, in good conscience, take off with a lead flight attendant who exhibits this level of egregious judgment. You are a danger to the CRM loop. Captain Brighton looked at the Port Authority officers. Officers, there has been a change of plans. I am officially removing Brenna Gable from this flight crew, effective immediately. Please escort her off my aircraft and down to the Oceanic Global Ground Operations Manager's office. She is suspended, pending a full corporate and federal review. The cabin erupted into a low murmur of shock, followed by a smattering of applause from the rows further back. The karma was immediate, brutal, and entirely justified. No, 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 Brenna sobbed, taking a step backward, shaking her head wildly. You can't do this. You can't throw me off my own flight. Mrs. Hinsley, tell them I was just doing what you asked. Margaret Hinsley suddenly found the ceiling panels of the Boeing 777 fascinating. She shrank back into the galley wall, refusing to make eye contact with the weeping flight attendant. The woman who had been so loud, so entitled, and so demanding just moments ago was now completely silent, terrified of drawing any more of Josie's wrath upon herself. The two Port Authority officers stepped forward, their demeanors shifting from authoritative to sternly bureaucratic. All right, miss, the lead officer said, gesturing toward the jet bridge door. You heard the captain? Let's go. Gather your belongings. Please, Brenna begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. She looked at Josie, her arrogance replaced by desperate pleading. Please, ma'am, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I misjudged the situation. Please don't ruin my life. Josie looked at the weeping woman, feeling no joy, only a profound, weary sadness that these situations still occurred. I am not ruining your life, Brenna, Josie said evenly. You made a series of deliberate choices based on ugly assumptions. Actions have consequences. Tonight, you are meeting yours. Josie sat back down in seat 1A and smoothly opened her book to the exact page she had bookmarked. Safe travels home. Defeated, humiliated, and sobbing, Brenna was gently but firmly escorted off the aircraft by the police officers. The heavy jet bridge door slammed shut behind her, finalizing her exile. Captain Brighton exhaled a long breath, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked at Margaret Hinsley, who was still standing awkwardly by the galley, clutching her designer bag. Mrs. Hinsley, Captain Brighton said, his voice clipped and entirely devoid of warmth. Your assigned seat is 3B. You will take it quietly. You will not speak to my crew unless it is an emergency, and you will not disturb Director Crawford again. If you cannot abide by these rules, you can follow Brenna out that door. Do I make myself perfectly clear? Yes, Captain, Margaret whispered meekly. She practically scurried down the aisle, keeping her head down, completely humiliated as the other first-class passengers watched her slide into the aisle seat next to the galley she had so vehemently despised. Captain Brighton turned back to Josie. Director Crawford, again, my deepest apologies. I will personally ensure the replacement flight attendant handles this cabin with the utmost professionalism. Can I get you anything before we push back? A glass of champagne? Some tea? Josie smiled, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. The system had worked, but only because she had the power to force it to. A fresh cup of Earl Grey would be lovely, Tom, she said softly. Thank you. It took another 25 minutes for the replacement flight attendant to arrive. The heavy rain continued to batter the tarmac at JFK, but inside the first-class cabin of Flight 88, the atmospheric pressure had entirely stabilized. The tension had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, almost reverent awe directed toward Seat 1A. The new lead flight attendant, a seasoned professional named Brenda, stepped onto the aircraft with an air of absolute competence. She had clearly been briefed by ground operations on the exact nature of the disaster she was walking into. Brenda didn't miss a beat. She greeted Captain Brighton, nodded respectfully to the Port Authority officers who were finally taking their leave, and immediately began standard pre-flight service. When Brenda reached Seat 1A, she knelt slightly, placing a steaming porcelain cup on Josie's console. "Director Crawford," Brenda said warmly, her voice genuine and soothing. "A fresh cup of Earl Grey, exactly as the captain requested. I am Brenda, the new lead for this cabin. On behalf of the entire Oceanic Global Flight crew, I want to extend my deepest apologies for the completely unacceptable behavior you endured. I assure you, for the next 7 hours, your comfort and safety are my absolute highest priorities." Josie took a sip of the tea. It was perfectly steeped. "Thank you, Brenda. I appreciate your professionalism. Let's just get this bird in the air." "Right away, ma'am." Brenda smiled, moving efficiently down the aisle. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, the reality of the situation settled over the other passengers. The white businessman in 1B, who had remained entirely silent during Josie's harassment, awkwardly leaned over his partition. "Excuse me," he whispered, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and belated solidarity. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry I didn't speak up. What she did to you was completely wrong. I should have said something." Josie looked at him over the rim of her glasses. She appreciated the apology, but she also recognized the inherent privilege in his silence. "Thank you for saying that," she replied evenly. "But apologies after the danger has passed are easy. Next time you see a flight attendant threatening to call armed police on a quiet passenger simply because she doesn't fit a visual profile, I hope you find your voice before the handcuffs come out." The man swallowed hard, nodding in chastised understanding. "You're right. You are absolutely right. Have a good flight, ma'am." Further back in the cabin, Margaret Hinsley was experiencing a descent into a very specific, luxurious kind of hell. Seat 3B was exactly what she had feared, but the reality was somehow much worse because she was trapped in it by her own hubris. Every time the heavy curtain separating first class from the galley swung open, it brushed aggressively against her shoulder. The smell of the convection ovens warming all the in-flight meals, garlic, roasted chicken, and steamed vegetables wafted directly into her airspace, clinging to her designer clothes. Worse yet, she was completely socially isolated. The other passengers in row 3 actively ignored her, disgusted by the entitlement she had displayed. When the seatbelt sign chimed off and the in-flight service began, Margaret aggressively hit her call button. Brenda appeared moments later, her customer service smile firmly in place, but her eyes devoid of any actual warmth. "Yes, Mrs. Hinsley. How can I assist you?" "This seat is entirely unacceptable," Margaret hissed, keeping her voice low so Captain Brighton wouldn't hear. "The curtain keeps hitting me, and the noise from the ice scoops is giving me a migraine. I need you to find me a better seat. Move someone in premium economy if you have to. Just get me out of this galley row." Brenda didn't blink. She didn't reach for her tablet. She simply looked down at Margaret with the cold, unyielding authority of a flight attendant who had the captain's full backing. "Mrs. Hinsley, as Captain Brighton explicitly informed you, 3B is your assigned seat for the duration of this flight to London Heathrow," Brenda stated quietly. "The cabin is entirely full, and I will not be displacing any other paying passengers to accommodate a preference, especially after the disruption you caused during boarding. I can offer you an eye mask and a pair of noise-cancelling headphones. Otherwise, I must ask that you refrain from pressing the call button unless you are experiencing a medical emergency." Margaret's mouth dropped open. "You are deliberately treating me poorly because of what happened up front. I will be reporting you to my husband." "You are welcome to report whatever you wish to, whoever you wish, ma'am," Brenda said politely, though the underlying steel in her voice was unmistakable. "But if you continue to harass the crew or complain about your assigned, fully functional lie-flat seat, I will inform the captain that you are violating his direct orders. Would you like me to do that?" Margaret looked toward the cockpit door, remembering the terrifying fury in the captain's eyes. She shrank back into the leather seat, pulling her blanket up to her chin. "No, just leave me alone." "Certainly. Enjoy your flight," Brenda said, smoothly turning on her heel and returning to the galley. For the rest of the transatlantic journey, Josie slept peacefully in the quiet sanctuary of 1A. The steady hum of the GE90 engines she had personally vetted the maintenance protocols for, lulled her into a deep, restorative rest. She woke up somewhere over the coast of Ireland, refreshed and ready for her week of meetings in London. The landing at Heathrow was flawless. As the plane taxied to the gate, Captain Brighton stepped out of the cockpit, standing by the exit door to personally bid farewell to the passengers. When Josie approached, he extended a warm hand. "A pleasure flying with you, Director Crawford. I hope the rest of the flight was up to standard." "It was perfect, Tom. Thank you for your integrity today. It means a great deal." "It's the only way to fly," the captain replied, his grip firm. But while Josie was stepping out into the cool London morning, a hurricane of corporate and federal consequences was making landfall back in New York. Brenna Gable had not been allowed to simply go home. She was escorted directly to the Oceanic Global Ground Operations Center, where her employee badge, tablet, and travel passes were confiscated. She was placed in a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room to await the arrival of the Regional Director of In-Flight Services and a representative from her union. Brenna was still crying, desperately trying to construct a narrative where she was the victim. "I was just trying to protect our platinum members," she sobbed to her union rep, a tough, no-nonsense man named Greg. "The passenger in 1A was hostile. She wouldn't show me her pass." Greg held up a hand, looking exhausted. He had just finished watching the security footage from the aircraft's cabin cameras and reading the preliminary incident report filed by Captain Brighton. "Stop talking, Brenna," Greg said bluntly. "Just stop. You are digging a hole you cannot climb out of." "But the union has to protect me," she pleaded. "The union protects you from unfair labor practices and management overreach," Greg corrected her, tossing a thick file onto the table. "The union does not protect you from violating Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 121. You bypassed CRM protocols. You actively lied about a double booking glitch that never existed. And worst of all, you attempted to weaponize Port Authority law enforcement against a compliant passenger without cause." The door opened, and Oceanic Global's regional HR director walked in, accompanied by legal counsel. They didn't even sit down. "Miss Gable," the HR director began, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "We have reviewed the statements from Captain Brighton, the first officer, the Port Authority police, and several passengers in first class. We have also confirmed the identity of the passenger you attempted to forcibly remove." "It was a mistake," Brenna whispered, the reality of her ruined career finally crushing the last of her ego. "It was a liability," the HR director corrected. "You harassed Josephine Crawford. She is the FAA's lead structural auditor. Do you understand what that means? You gave one of the most powerful aviation safety regulators in the Western Hemisphere a first-hand demonstration of a catastrophic breakdown in our crew training and safety protocols. You created a hostile environment based on visual profiling. He slid a single piece of paper across the table. Oceanic Global has a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory conduct and the misuse of law enforcement. Your employment is terminated, effectively immediately. Brenner stared at the paper. Fired. But my severance? My flight benefits? Revoked. The lawyer stepped in. Furthermore, because you actively interfered with the duties of a flight crew and created a false security panic, Oceanic Global is legally required to report this incident to the Federal Aviation Administration. You will be placed on the National Aviation Watch List for crew members. You will likely never work for a Part 121 commercial carrier in the United States again. The hard karma was absolute. Brenner had tried to wield institutional power as a weapon against someone she deemed inferior. Now, the full, unfeeling weight of that same institution was crushing her out of the industry entirely. Meanwhile, at the corporate headquarters of Oceanic Global's parent company in Chicago, another reckoning was unfolding. Gordon Reed, the CEO of the massive conglomerate, sat at the head of a mahogany boardroom table. He was a ruthless, pragmatic businessman who cared about two things: stock prices and regulatory compliance. On the table in front of him was a direct email from Josie Crawford, outlining the exact nature of the harassment she had faced, specifically highlighting the involvement of a woman named Margaret Hinsley. Sitting nervously at the opposite end of the table was Charles Hinsley, Margaret's husband. Charles was a mid-level regional vice president, a man who enjoyed the perks of his title but had virtually no real power within the executive stratosphere. "Charles," Gordon Reed said, his voice dangerously quiet, "do you know why I pulled you out of your marketing quarterly review this morning?" I assume it has to do with my wife's flight to London, Gordon?" Charles stammered, sweating profusely through his expensive suit. Margaret had called him from Heathrow, crying hysterically about being forced to sit by the galley and claiming she was abused by the flight crew. "Your wife," Gordon said, lacing his fingers together, "attempted to use your name and your relatively insignificant title to bully our flight crew into illegally ejecting the global director of aeronautical structural safety from her assigned seat. Your wife demanded that a black woman who holds the keys to our entire fleet's federal compliance be dragged off an airplane in handcuffs so she could have a window seat." Charles turned the color of old parchment. "Gordon, I assure you, Margaret can be difficult, but I had no knowledge of this." "I don't care if you had knowledge of it, Charles. I care about the exposure," Gordon snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "Our corporate code of conduct explicitly prohibits family members from using employee affiliations to harass staff or bypass operational protocols. Because of your wife's disgusting entitlement, Oceanic Global is now facing a massive PR nightmare and an impending internal audit by the FAA regarding our customer service training. We rely on Director Crawford's goodwill to keep our maintenance schedules running smoothly." "I will handle Margaret," Charles pleaded. "I'll revoke her flight privileges. It won't happen again." "You're damn right it won't happen again," Gordon said coldly, "because you no longer have flight privileges. In fact, you no longer have a department. Effective at the end of the month, your regional division is being restructured. Your position is being eliminated." Charles stared at the CEO, his entire world collapsing in the span of 3 minutes. "Gordon, please, I've been with this company for 15 years. You can't fire me over a seating dispute. I am firing you because you are a liability, Charles. Your wife weaponized this company's name to enact her own bigotry, and she did it to the most powerful woman on that airplane. Gordon stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Clean out your desk by Friday, and tell Margaret that the next time she flies, she'll be buying her own economy tickets on a competitor's airline. The fallout was swift, silent, and entirely devastating. The structures of power that Brenner and Margaret had relied upon to assert their dominance had turned on them with mechanical efficiency. Months later, Josie Crawford sat in her spacious office in Washington, D.C., looking out over the Potomac River. A framed, newly updated certification for Oceanic Global's 777 fleet sat on her desk. She had approved it, objectively and fairly, because the aircraft was safe. The machinery worked. The engineering was sound. She took a sip of her Earl Grey tea, perfectly at peace. She didn't dwell on the flight attendant who had lost her career, or the obnoxious woman whose husband had lost his job. She didn't have to. Josie had simply held her ground, demanded her space, and let the sheer weight of her undeniable excellence do the rest. The universe, guided by a heavy dose of federal protocol, had naturally course-corrected. In the end, the incident on Flight 88 was a masterclass in the quiet, unshakable power of dignity. True authority does not need to shout, nor does it require the weaponization of rules to intimidate the vulnerable. Josephine Crawford proved that excellence and unyielding composure are the ultimate shields against prejudice. By simply occupying the space she had rightfully earned, she exposed the fragile, hollow entitlement of those who sought to diminish her. The swift, uncompromising karma that befell Brenner and the Hinsleys was not an act of vengeance, but the natural consequence of a system violently rejecting their toxic biases. It stands as a profound reminder. The world is changing, and the old assumptions no longer fly. Those who attempt to wield unearned superiority will inevitably find themselves grounded, while those who stand firmly in their truth will always own the sky.